Ankara considers the Kurdish forces in this area to be a terrorist organization. Why?
Well, there has been historically a link between the YPG, which is the main Kurdish element of the Syrian Democratic Forces that you referred to in that report. And the YPG is very closely related to the PKK, or at least was very closely related to the PKK, with which Turkey has been effectively in conflict over the last 3.5 decades. That is the essential background to it. The big question now, though, is what has been the role of Kurdish forces within the SDF over the last couple of years or so. Attempts by Ankara to persuade the United States and others that it is still a terrorist organization, still operating as part of the PKK, have fallen on deaf ears in Washington and most of the capitals of the European Union. And for very good reason, because at least over the last period, there has been extremely little evidence that as part of the SDF, the Kurds have been launching attacks into Turkey or providing weapons for the PKK in Turkey or providing any other assistance to the PKK in Turkey, in the very obvious knowledge that if they started doing that, their position, their strength, the strength of their relations with Washington and other European capitals will be undermined. It has been in their very strong interest to try and keep that as clean as possible. But that's not the real issue, I think, for the Turks. The Turks are looking for a reason, whether it's invented or not. They've been determined to go ahead with this plan for some considerable time, well before the most recent talks with Washington. Last year, they seemed to have persuaded Donald Trump, last December, to let them go ahead with the operation. That backfired. It's been back on the agenda again for the last few months. They've been putting more and more pressure on the United States, despite the fact that US troops have been operating together with the SDF in that corridor, ensuring that it's a pretty neutral zone, no real security threat to Turkey, at least over the last period. So it's pretty clear, I would say, that the motivations behind this Turkish operation are not really to do with security, at least not immediate security.
Rob, a bigger question here, as we heard from our correspondent Jasper Mortimer in Ankara, saying that the Turkish troops had been amassed on the border, 5,000 to 10,000 of them. Kurdish forces, for their part, saying that they will defend themselves, they'll do everything in their power to do so. Will they be able to take on the Turkish forces?
Well, I think it really depends on, first of all, what the Turks want to do. If they're determined to establish a corridor perhaps 300 kilometers long and 32 kilometers deep, as has been suggested, then that would certainly bring them into strong conflict with the SDF and Kurdish forces. If, however, bearing in mind the threats that they've had from Donald Trump to obliterate the Turkish economy, if they go off limits, and they decide to launch a much more limited operation than that, and there's been some suggestion that it'll be between the towns of Tel Abyad and Ras Al Ain, about 100 kilometers long, and maybe not much more than 10 kilometers deep, in an area which is not predominantly populated by Kurds but by Arabs, then the possibility is that the operation will be successful without any serious conflict with the Kurds. That really is the big question at the moment. And from the Kurdish perspective, I think, if this turns into a major conflict with the Turks, the big question will be, will Turkey have control of the air? Judging by what's been happening today, there have been strikes on Ras Al Ain, by one account at least. So it does suggest that although the Americans have said they will not cooperate with the Turks in control of the airspace, that the Turks are going to push ahead and try to establish an air presence there in any case. Will the Russians allow the Turks to have that control? Because if you remember last year, when the Turks launched their operation in Afrin, further to the west in northern Syria, the Russians gave effectively Turks control of that airspace. And that was absolutely critical in the military fight against the Kurds in and around Afrin. The Kurds were forced out, 300,000 refugees as a consequence. Much will depend on airspace control.
And Rob, this is something that you alluded to earlier. Actually, Republicans in the US currently are very concerned that this move by Turkey could in fact end up playing into the hands of the Russians, who've had an immense role to play when it comes to this conflict in the region.
Yes, absolutely. And we've seen a huge backlash from Republicans as well, of course, Democrats in the United States. I think it's taken Donald Trump by surprise. He wasn't expecting such a firestorm, I don't think, and that's why we've seen him jumping from one position to another. First of all, saying that the troops are going to come out, then we're not betraying the Kurds at all, they're fine fighters, all that sort of stuff. Confusion all around, confusion in Turkey, confusion in Russia, confusion in Iran, which is why the Iranians have moved their troops, I'm sure, up to the border, because they don't know what's going to happen next, and confusion on the Kurdish side as well. So, you know, obviously there is concern in the United States that this could play into the hands of what they would consider enemies of the United States. In the first place, Russia, second place, Iran. By ceding control of northeast Syria to Turkey and pushing the Kurds out and pushing the Kurds perhaps into the hands of Damascus, they lose control effectively of that pathway between Iran and the Mediterranean leading to Lebanon. That has always been a major concern of strategists in the Pentagon. Donald Trump, without consulting the Pentagon, seems to be giving that away. That's what the concern is really about.
Rob, thank you for that analysis.